Take a look at your controller, no matter what console it's for. There's always that one button that feels like the main one. The button you press to jump, confirm, or start something. For Nintendo players, that's the A button. For Xbox players, still the A button. Even PlayStation's cross button does the same job. But have you ever wondered why that is? Why the A button, out of all possible letters, became the main button in gaming? To really understand that, we need to go back to before the NES, back to when games didn't have letters at all. Just big, glowing arcade buttons. Before home consoles took over, gaming lived in the arcades. And arcade machines had a very different design philosophy. Every cabinet was custom built for each individual game. If you walked into an arcade, you would see hundreds of cabinets, all with different layouts. Some had one button, some had two, some had six. Donkey Kong had one jump button. Space Invaders had a fire button. Street Fighter II had 6 attack buttons. But they all had one thing in common. The main action button was almost always the lowest and rightmost one, the one that felt best to hit with your dominant hand. It wasn't labeled A, but it was functionally the same thing. Arcade designers learned early that the player's right hand was their power hand, or their action hand, and that the easiest, most comfortable spot for it was the lower right area of the control panel. So when Nintendo started thinking about a home console controller, they were already inheriting that ergonomic logic from the arcade world. When Nintendo created the Famicom in 1983, Gunpei Yokoi and his team wanted to shrink that arcade experience into something you could hold in your hands. They asked themselves, how can we make something feel as intuitive as an arcade cabinet, but small, simple, and universal? That led to the now iconic D-pad on the left, which we talked about in the last video, and the 2 action buttons on the right. Instead of labeling them jump and shoot, which would only work for certain games, Nintendo chose letters, A and B. They were simple, language neutral, and flexible enough for any action. Jump or shoot might not make sense in every country, but A and B, everyone can understand simple letters. And since players were used to the rightmost arcade button being the main one, Nintendo made sure the A button sat in the same comfortable spot on the right, perfectly under your thumb. But there's still something a little interesting here. On the NES controller, the buttons go from B to A, left to right. That's backwards alphabetically, but also totally intentional. If Nintendo had arranged them alphabetically, the A would have been on the left and slightly harder to hit. But through testing, they found that players prefer using their thumb on the rightmost button for the main actions. So, even though it broke the alphabet order, the A button was placed where your thumb naturally wanted to go. That's why in Super Mario Bros. You held B to run and tapped A to jump, the main satisfying action. Over millions of play sessions, players learned one thing by heart. A means go, A means yes, A means do the thing. But the layout didn't just feel right physically, it also made sense psychologically. The letter A already has a meaning in our brains. It's the first letter of the alphabet, the top grade in school, or the symbol of number 1. So when people saw the letter A, their brains already treated it as the primary choice. Nintendo didn't need to explain anything. Your thumb and your instincts agreed. It just made sense. It was a perfect storm of arcade muscle memory, ergonomic design, and human psychology. Now as Nintendo evolved, they kept building on that same foundation. The Super Nintendo added X and Y buttons, but A stayed in that sweet spot, the main button position. Game Boy, Nintendo 64, GameCube, Wii, the Switch, all of them continued to center gameplay around that same basic logic. And since Nintendo dominated the market for years, their conventions became everyone's conventions. Once Sega entered the home console race, they borrowed heavily from Nintendo's groundwork. Their Genesis controller used A, B, and C, but still arranged them so the rightmost button was the main one. The pattern was clear. The rightmost button was the main action, and letters were clear and universal. By the early 90s, that setup wasn't just a Nintendo standard, it was a gaming standard. When Microsoft entered the console world in 2001 with the original Xbox, they had a decision to make. They could invent a totally new control scheme, or they could build on what players already knew. And they chose familiarity. Microsoft based their controller's 4-button diamond layout directly on the Super Nintendo's. The same letters, A, B, X, and Y, just different colors. But more importantly, they kept the A button as the main one, right in the most natural thumb position. This was a smart move. By keeping the A button in that spot, players who'd grown up with Nintendo would instantly feel at home. It didn't matter that it was a new console, their thumbs already knew what to do. So while the Xbox controller evolved over time, the A button's dominance never changed. It's still the button you press to jump, confirm, or start. That's not a coincidence, that's Nintendo's 1980s design DNA still running the show. Sony, on the other hand, took a completely different approach. at least on the surface.
I got a little surprise for you here.
Check it out. What do you think about that?
When designing the original PlayStation controller, designer Teiyu Goto wanted to avoid letters and numbers altogether. Instead, he chose symbols to give each button a visual meaning. Circle meant yes or confirm, cross meant no or cancel, square represented menus or documents, and triangle symbolized perspective or a camera view. So from this perspective, Sony copied the exact same layout that Nintendo had, just different symbols. It was elegant and intuitive, at least in Japan. But when PlayStation launched in the West, something interesting happened. After some testing feedback, when Sony brought the PlayStation over to the western part of the world, test audiences instinctively pressed X to select, not circle, due to symbolism and muscle memory from other media interfaces. In Western computer interfaces, X often means confirm or choose. You can think of an X in a checkbox or selecting something here, whereas circle can be ambiguous or even resemble a no symbol, like a slash through zero. So while Nintendo's A and Sony's circle occupied the same physical position on their controllers, Sony's Western team flipped the meanings to match what felt natural to North American users. So in North America and Europe, cross became yes, even though in Japan it still meant no. Sony never intended for it to work that way, but it proved how strong Nintendo's influence already was. Even with completely different symbols, the idea of bottom right equals confirm was too deeply wired to undo. At this point, it's not just a layout, it's instinct. Gamers around the world have decades of muscle memory tied to pressing the A button to confirm, jump, or start. Even today, the biggest frustration when switching between consoles isn't learning a new game, it's remembering which button is A, mainly from Nintendo to anything else. That's how deep the legacy runs. So why did A become the main button in gaming? Well, that's because Nintendo built it on the lessons learned from the arcade era. They designed it to be comfortable, logical, and universal, and the rest of the industry followed. Microsoft leaned into it for familiarity. Sony tried to redefine it symbolically, and even they couldn't escape its pull. The A button isn't just a letter anymore, it's an idea. From the neon glow of the arcades to the living rooms of millions, that single letter A became the heartbeat of video game controls. It represents how game design, ergonomics, and psychology came together to create something timeless. Every time you press it, you're carrying decades of history. From the arcades to the NES to every console you've touched since. So the next time you hit that A button, whether it's green, blue, or shaped like a cross, think of it as a tiny echo of the design choices that shaped gaming as we know it. But that's all for this video. Which controller do you think has the best layout? Are the Sony symbols better than the typical letters everyone else went with? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next one.